There's a story that keeps circulating in political circles, finance circles, and the loudest corners of the internet. It starts with a simple comparison. The United States spends $997 billion on defense, while Europe spends $454 billion. And from that single chart, people draw a sweeping conclusion. Europe is helpless. Europe needs America. And therefore, America can dictate terms on security, trade, foreign policy, even domestic politics, because Europe has no real leverage. That conclusion is persuasive for one reason. It feels measurable. It's clean. It's numeric. It turns geopolitics into a scoreboard. But it's also a category error, because military spending is not the source of power. It's the output of power. The real question is not who spends more on tanks. The real question is, how does a country afford to spend what it spends, year after year, decade after decade, without collapsing under the weight of its own ambition? How does the United States afford 11 aircraft carrier strike groups and a global network of roughly 750 military bases? Because those things are not created by patriotism. They're not created by speeches. They're not created by vibes. They are created by a financial and economic system that has made the United States the central node of the modern world. And if you want to understand Europe's real power, why it is far more formidable than the Europe is weak narrative suggests, you have to stop counting tanks and start looking at systems. Systems of trade, systems of finance, systems of regulation, systems of standards, systems of technology. Because Europe sits inside the machinery that makes American power possible. And that means Europe has leverage, not hypothetical leverage, not rhetorical leverage, real leverage. If you're here for that kind of analysis, make sure you subscribe, because the world is moving into an era where power will be decided less by headline military budgets and more by who controls the pipelines of money, technology, supply chains, and legitimacy. Now let's start where modern power actually begins, with trust. The underestimated foundation of American power, trust as infrastructure. The United States is powerful for many reasons: geography, population, innovation, alliances. But one reason towers above the rest in the modern era: the dollar and the global financial architecture built around it. The world uses dollars because it trusts America. The world buys U.S. Treasury bonds because it trusts America. Global finance routes through U.S.-linked institutions and systems because market participants trust the U.S. to remain stable, predictable, and broadly rule-following. And that trust is not a soft concept. It is not goodwill. It's not popularity. Trust is infrastructure. It's what allows American borrowing costs to remain lower than they would otherwise be. It's what allows the U.S. to run persistent deficits without triggering an immediate crisis. It's what allows the U.S. to finance a global military posture at a scale no historical empire could match. Economists sometimes call this the exorbitant privilege of reserve currency status. In plain language, it means the world treats U.S. debt and U.S. assets like the default safe harbor. Capital flows into the U.S. in a way that gives America strategic flexibility that other powers do not enjoy. But here's the crucial point. This isn't a law of nature. It's not permanent. It's not guaranteed. It's a system. And systems can be weakened. They can be contested. And they can be eroded, slowly, then all at once. So if you want to assess whether Europe is powerful, you don't start with how many jets Europe can launch tomorrow. You start with what Europe can do to the system that keeps U.S. power cheap to maintain. Because if that system cracks, aircraft carriers become vastly more expensive. Global basing becomes politically harder. Budget battles become existential. And that's before you even get to the second layer of modern power: market access. Market access is a weapon, and Europe has 450 million consumers. Here's a sentence that sounds boring until you grasp the implications. Europe is one of the largest, richest consumer markets on Earth, about 450 million people. In a global economy, market access is a weapon. If you are a multinational corporation, you do not treat Europe as optional. If you are a government that wants to punish another government, the ability to influence whether its flagship companies can operate in a top-tier market is a form of coercive power. And Europe doesn't just have market size. Europe also has regulatory power. And this is where we need to introduce a term that sounds technical, but is incredibly important: the Brussels effect. The Brussels effect is the idea that when the EU sets strict rules on privacy, product safety, competition, environment, digital markets, global companies often comply worldwide, not just inside Europe, because it's cheaper to run one compliance system than multiple. That means Europe exports rules. It exports standards. It exports constraints. And in a world where technology, data, and supply chains determine economic winners, the ability to set standards is the ability to shape the battlefield. So already, the Europe is weak narrative has a problem. Europe may not have the biggest military, but Europe has the kind of economic and regulatory weight that can determine who profits, who expands, who gets access, and who gets squeezed. Now let's connect this to the deeper engine of American power: the transatlantic relationship itself. The transatlantic relationship is not friendly trade, it's the core of the West. People talk about US-EU relations like they're a diplomatic preference or a cultural alliance. In reality, the US-EU relationship is a massive economic machine. The figures often cited in the type of analysis you referenced are worth repeating because they're the kind of numbers that change how you see the world. The US and the EU together represent 43% of global GDP and nearly 30% of global trade. In 2024, transatlantic trade is cited as reaching about $168 trillion. European companies directly employ about 5 million Americans. European investment in the United States is cited at around $3.2 trillion, roughly 56% of all foreign investment in the US. European countries collectively are often cited as holding around $8 trillion in US bonds and equities. If these numbers are even approximately right, and they are broadly consistent with how analysts describe the transatlantic economic relationship, then the idea that Europe is helpless is absurd. Because Europe isn't just an ally, Europe is deeply embedded in the US economy. European capital, European corporate presence, European supply chains, European consumers, and European regulation all materially shape the environment US businesses operate in. And the reverse is also true. American tech giants, consumer brands, financial institutions, and industrial exporters all rely on Europe's market. This relationship is not a side story. It's the structural foundation of what people call the West. So when someone says, America can do whatever it wants, what they're really claiming, often without realizing it, is that America can jeopardize the most integrated economic relationship on the planet without consequence. That's not strength. That's a failure to understand how modern power works. And here's the next key insight. Europe's leverage is often misunderstood because Europe rarely uses it dramatically. Europe tends to use power through law, regulation, standards, procurement rules, and market access. Which brings us to the tool sometimes described as Europe's trade bazooka. Europe's trade bazooka and the logic of economic retaliation. The European Union has a mechanism designed for a world where coercion is economic more often than military. It's called the anti-coercion instrument. The EU built it because it recognized a modern truth. States increasingly use tariffs, sanctions, embargoes, export controls, and regulatory discrimination as weapons. In plain terms, the anti-coercion instrument gives the EU legal and administrative pathways to respond to coercive measures by restricting access to the EU market. That can mean things like limiting public procurement access, restricting investment, imposing trade and service barriers, targeting specific firms and individuals. and tightening regulatory approvals. Here's why this matters. In the US, people sometimes imagine sanctions as something that only Washington does. But Europe has its own ability to impose costs, and not just symbolic costs. If you have 450 million relatively wealthy consumers, and you can make market access harder for certain companies, you don't need aircraft carriers to create leverage. You need coordinated policy. Now, a fair counterargument is obvious. Europe is politically fragmented. It has internal disagreements. It often struggles to act decisively. That is real. But here's the strategic point. Europe doesn't need perfect unity to create meaningful leverage. It needs enough unity to impose marginal costs that change corporate behavior, investor expectations, and domestic political pressure in the US. Economic retaliation doesn't need to destroy America to be powerful. It needs to change incentives. And this is where tank counters consistently fail. They treat power like it only exists at maximum intensity. In reality, power is often exercised through calibrated pressure, small enough to be survivable, large enough to be painful, and targeted enough to create political consequence. Now let's go one level deeper into something that sounds niche until you realize it's national security level leverage, pharmaceuticals and medical supply chains. The quiet superweapon, health supply chains and pharmaceutical dependence. If you want to understand leverage, look at what societies cannot function without. Modern states are not held together by tanks. They are held together by logistics, by medicine, by industrial inputs, by critical components. One of the most sensitive examples is pharmaceuticals. The figures cited in your reference script are stark. The US is the world's largest pharmaceutical importer. Since 2023, pharmaceuticals are cited as the top American import from the EU, around $170 billion. Europe is cited as supplying roughly 25% of active pharmaceutical ingredients used in American drug manufacturing. And 90% of US biotech companies are cited as relying on imported components. Now, you don't have to imagine some cartoon scenario where Europe turns off medicine overnight. That's not how any of this works. The point is subtler and more realistic. If political relations deteriorate, regulatory friction rises, approvals slow, procurement becomes political. Compliance burdens increase, supply becomes less flexible, and the shock doesn't need to be total to be impactful, because health systems run on tight margins. Hospitals do not stockpile years of everything, and politicians do not enjoy explaining shortages. So when people say Europe can't hurt the US, ask them, what happens when a deeply integrated supply chain becomes contested? That's not a military question. That's a state capacity question. Now we reach the most sensitive layer of all, financial markets and reserve currency status. The dollar's real weakness is that it depends on predictability. The dollar's reserve status is not just because America is powerful. It's because the world believes the US is institutionally stable, legally predictable, politically credible, and fundamentally committed to maintaining a system others can rely on. Here's the paradox. That same reserve status is what makes the US powerful, and it's also what makes the US vulnerable. Because if the US is seen as unpredictable, or worse, willing to break alliances and treaties, then the world doesn't need to overthrow the dollar. It only needs to diversify away from dependence. Even a small, steady diversification can matter. Because the US system runs on constant demand for US assets. If demand shifts at the margin, borrowing costs rise at the margin. And marginal changes over time can create huge consequences, especially for a country running large deficits while funding a global posture. This is why you often see analysts link reserve currency status to military power. When borrowing becomes more expensive, sustaining global military infrastructure becomes harder. Now, does this mean the dollar collapses tomorrow? No. And anyone selling that narrative is usually selling you a story. But does it mean the dollar's privilege can be weakened over time by political self-harm and alliance breakdown? Absolutely. And this is where Europe's role matters, because Europe is not just another country. Europe is one of the largest holders of U.S. assets and one of the deepest partners in the system that generates global trust in the U.S. Europe's behavior influences global perceptions. If Europe starts behaving like a bloc that no longer fully trusts American predictability, that signal matters. Now, let's widen the lens historically, because modern power didn't fall from the sky. It was built. How the U.S. built the post-war system and why Europe was central to it after World War II. The U.S. didn't just win, it architected a world. The key pieces of that architecture included Bretton Woods institutions that anchored post-war finance, a global role for the dollar, the Marshall Plan and rebuilding Western Europe, the expansion of trade and capital flows, and crucially, NATO as an institutional security framework that locked Europe and America into a shared order. This was not charity. It was strategy. The U.S. built a system where Western Europe became a stable cluster of rich democracies, integrated markets, forward bases, and a legitimacy engine for American leadership. Because American power is not only coercive, it is also consensual. It persuades others to participate, and participation is what creates scale. Now imagine what happens when the perception spreads that America can no longer be relied upon as a predictable hegemon. A hegemon doesn't fall because it loses a war tomorrow. A hegemon falls because others stop structuring their futures around it. And the first place that shift becomes visible is among allies. That's why Europe matters. Europe is the credibility anchor of the Western alliance system. If Europe signals that credibility is broken, the entire global system reads it. Now let's address a major objection, because it's the one people bring up immediately. It is true that Europe relies heavily on the U.S. in several areas, including strategic airlift, intelligence and surveillance, certain precision strike capabilities, nuclear deterrence at the NATO level, and some elements of command and control. Europe's defense capability is uneven across countries, and Europe has long underinvested relative to the threat environment. Those are facts. But here's what people get wrong. The claim, Europe needs America militarily, is not the same as Europe has no power. Europe can be militarily dependent in some domains and still be economically and structurally powerful. In fact, that's the entire point of this analysis. Power is multidimensional. Europe's influence comes from its market, its regulation, its investment, its ability to coordinate policy across advanced economies, and its embeddedness in U.S. prosperity itself. And in the modern world, those levers can be as strategically decisive as military force, especially in disputes between allies, where military confrontation is the least likely pathway. So Europe's power is not the power of invasion, it's the power of system shaping. Now, we need to connect this to the global landscape, because the stakes aren't just US versus Europe. The stakes are, what happens to the broader world if the West fractures? If the transatlantic relationship deteriorates seriously, the obvious winners are strategic rivals that want the West divided. Because the greatest comparative advantage of the US-led order has always been coalition scale. When the US is aligned with Europe, it can set global standards, coordinate sanctions, control critical technologies, shape investment rules, and isolate adversaries more effectively. When the West fractures, that capacity weakens. Not because America becomes weak overnight, but because coordination becomes harder. And in geopolitics, coordination is power. Now, this doesn't mean Europe should break the West. Quite the opposite. Europe's leverage is often used as deterrence and constraint, keeping the relationship functional by ensuring there are costs to reckless behavior. That's how mature alliances work. They're not based on permanent harmony, they're based on shared interests, reinforced by institutional commitments, and stabilized by credible consequences for breaking the rules. Now, let's bring this down from the strategic level into a concrete, realistic model of how power would actually be exercised. A realistic European response to serious US unpredictability would probably not look like dramatic headlines. It would look like regulatory tightening, competition policy enforcement, targeted procurement restrictions, digital and data governance changes, coordinated tariff responses, and signaling shifts in investment posture. These measures can sound boring, but they can materially affect corporate revenue, valuation multiples, investor confidence, and domestic political coalitions in the US. The EU is particularly strong at one thing: turning politics into compliance. Europe's power often arrives as a letter from a regulator, a standards requirement, a procurement rule, a privacy framework, or an antitrust decision, followed by corporate compliance because the alternative is losing access to a massive market. This is what makes Europe seem weak to people who only recognize power when it explodes. Europe's power often doesn't explode. It tightens, it constrains, it shapes. Now, to be balanced, we also need to explain the limits, because overhyping Europe would be the same mistake in reverse. Europe's largest vulnerabilities are internal: political fragmentation, slow decision-making, divergent threat perceptions between member states, energy and industrial policy disagreements, and periodic crises that distract from strategic focus. Europe also tends to avoid escalation because Europe is deeply dependent on economic stability. Where the US can sometimes treat instability like a distant problem, Europe often experiences it directly, through migration shocks, energy price shocks, and neighborhood crises. So Europe's leverage is often used reluctantly. It's more comfortable as a stabilizer than as an aggressor. That's real. But notice what that still implies. Even when used reluctantly, Europe's leverage exists, and the mere existence of leverage shapes negotiation. It shapes what other actors can credibly threaten to do. Now let's widen the lens one last time, because the next decade is going to test these dynamics more than the last two did. Why this matters now: multipolarity, tech fragmentation, and economic security. The world is moving into a multipolar environment where technology ecosystems may fragment, supply chains are being de-risked, industrial policy is back, and economic security is treated as national security. In that environment, alliances are not optional. They are force multipliers. But alliances also depend on credibility. And credibility, again, is trust. If credibility erodes, you don't get an immediate collapse. You get hedging, you get diversification, you get slow shifts that become hard to reverse. That's how reserve currency privilege weakens. That's how standards power diffuses. That's how coalitions lose their edge. And Europe, because of its embedded role in transatlantic prosperity and institutional legitimacy, becomes one of the key actors determining whether the US-led system remains cohesive. This is why the simplistic Europe is helpless narrative is not only wrong, it's strategically dangerous, because it encourages reckless assumptions. And reckless assumptions are how systems break. Now let's land this with the core takeaway. The bottom line: Europe's power is structural, not spectacular. If you count tanks, you'll underestimate Europe. If you look at systems, you'll see Europe clearly. Europe has one of the largest consumer markets on Earth, deep regulatory and standards power, heavy integration into US prosperity through investment and trade, leverage across supply chains that touch health and high-tech sectors, and a decisive role in the trust that underpins the Western order. Europe cannot outcarrier the United States, but Europe can impose costs. Europe can constrain behavior. Europe can shape rules. And Europe can influence the stability of the system that makes American military dominance affordable. That is real power. It's just not the kind of power that fits neatly into a meme. If you want more long-form scripts like this, deep, evidence-based, and focused on how power actually works, hit subscribe, leave a like, and comment below. Do you think Europe would ever use its economic leverage aggressively if the transatlantic relationship seriously deteriorated, or will Europe always prioritize stability over confrontation?